Great.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And as Colette was saying, I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about the Stroud Valleys Dipper Project in relation to citizen science and developing a survey of the River Frome catchment. That's a good start. Oops, daisy. Let me just see if that will. No, I'm going to have to escape and go back in, I think. It seems to have nicely hung. That's a good start, isn't it? Just see if that will, there we go, we can forward it that way. First of all, a very quick introduction to myself and a sort of background to various projects involving particularly birds. I started off in the Lake District National Park. I was very lucky to get a job with the ranger for the Buttermere area. I spent a year doing various jobs around Buttermere and Crummock Water. I then worked for a number of years for the British Antarctic Survey as a field biologist, including 3 years down in Antarctica itself, which was rather marvellous, and then did a variety of postdocs at the University of Durham, including some up in the flow country of Scotland, chasing golden plover, greenshank and dunlin. I then worked at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust as their head of research and did a fellowship at the University of Bath. After which I had my own consultancy, ERT Conservation, mainly dealing with spatial analysis in the developing countries. And for the last 9 years, I've been a senior lecturer in ecology at the University of Gloucestershire, mainly teaching on our postgraduate applied ecology course. Before we start dippers, I'm going to take you on a little journey, and hopefully we will. Well, trust me, we will get to dippers eventually, but we're going to go a little bit round, and hopefully you'll see the relevance of this when we complete the circle. So, local species monitoring, what is all the fuss about, and why is this so important? Well, I'm going to start in a slightly unusual place. This is a graph of human population growth between 1950 and projected to the year 2050. Year along the x-axis on the bottom, and then human population in billions on the y vertical axis. And you can see that there are 3 projections, low, medium and high. We have missed the low projection, so we're probably on that red line, which means by 2050 we will be at about 10.5 billion people on the planet. Now, I was born in 1961 when there were 3 and a bit billion people. So in my lifetime, I'm going to see the world population treble. But that red line doesn't really slap you around the face. So you have to see this in a particular context. What that red line actually means is this. In order to get from current 8 billion to 10.5 billion by the year 2050, you need to add 1 million people to the human population every 5 days. That's numerically how you do it. That's net of death. So in 5 days' time, there's going to be 1 million extra people on the planet. And of course, those people require primary needs: food, shelter, water. Obviously, we're very interested in that tonight, and energy. These are the fundamental elements that allow individuals to lead fulfilled and self-actuated lives. And achieving even just those basic human needs before we get into any of the other resource uses that we undertake, those basic needs have a huge impact on species, habitats, and ecosystems. And a lovely picture there of a trip I did to Borneo with oil palm plantations absolutely covering the landscape. And these human impacts on our environment are often called the big 4. So the really big one is habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. Then invasive species and diseases, overexploitation, so that includes extraction, fishing, bushmeat poaching, and all of those things, and then climate change. and I often have to be very careful with climate change because I'm going to say merely additive to the first three is climate change. And climate change is obviously going to have a huge effect, and we know this. But at the moment, the primary concern in terms of impacts on environment and biodiversity is actually habitat loss. We are still losing, degrading, and fragmenting our habitats across the globe at a frightening speed. Climate change is going to exacerbate that problem, but the number of species, if you imagine an extinct species represented by a ball bearing, the number of species currently made extinct by climate change would fit in the palm of my hands. The number of species made extinct by habitat loss would probably fill a big cathedral. It's a huge, huge problem. So going back to our question, local species monitoring, what's all the fuss about? What it does is it provides the data and solutions to underpin, guide, and evaluate conservation actions. That's what local species monitoring is set up to do. So why undertake local species monitoring? Well, given the big four, there has never been a more important time to do this. We are currently in an era of change. In the UK, we have local nature recovery strategies. LNRS is a statutory function, and we are trying to recover, never mind halt the loss and change in biodiversity in this country, and that's going to be a very, very big task. So what has any of that got the hell to do with dippers and indeed citizen science? What's interesting, of course, is the impacts of the big four that I mentioned at global scales are exactly the same issues that we find at micro scales. For example, our beloved River Frome that runs through Stroud. They're exactly the same. So habitat loss and degradation, extraction, climate change and pollution, and so on. And given all of that, we are often faced with this problem: is nature recovery actually possible? We've got 70 million people on this tiny little island, all madly using resources, all wanting, we've got another 1.5 million houses being built. How are we going to recover nature? This big idea we've got in England to recover nature. So let me talk a little bit about dippers, and then I'll come to the dipper project itself. So there are 5 species of dipper recognized currently: the white-throated, the brown dipper, the American dipper, the white-capped, and the rufous-throated. And these are their distributions around the world. The rufous-throated, you can see, is a tiny little distribution on the edge of Peru and Argentina, whereas the white-throated dipper across Europe has quite a fragmented distribution, lots of different but very large patches. In the UK and Ireland, this is the data from the 2008-2011 National Atlas. Going to be very interesting. Obviously, the Atlas is being renewed over the next couple of years, and it's going to be very interesting to look at the difference between dippers now and how they were in 2008-11. So that gives the breeding distribution, that gives the breeding relative abundance, and that gives the wintering relative abundance. So you can see in the UK they are mainly north and west in distribution. They are distributed in the highest breeding densities in the uplands, and you can see, just make out our tiny little Gloucestershire patch there, this very strange little population that we have here in Stroud. In terms of conservation status and trends, that graph is rather depressing. You can see it's an index on the y-axis against year on the x-axis, and this is dipper population abundance in the United Kingdom from 1994 till the present time. Currently, there's thought to be less than 7,000 pairs, and on the UK Birds of Conservation Concern, they are currently amber listed. That's because since 1995, there's been a 52% decline in breeding numbers, a 39% decline since 2013, and a 30% decline since 2018. So something is going on with our dipper populations. They're not doing particularly well. And there's been between 1968 and 2011, i.e. the last Atlas period, there's been a decrease in about 11% in terms of its breeding range. There is some evidence of small winter range expansion, which may be related to climate differences across that time period on waterways. We don't actually know. And again, it's going to be very interesting to see what the new Atlas brings up. Now, I'm not going to read all of this slide. This is just to say, in terms of ecology, we know a lot about dippers. There are hundreds of studies. There are lots of different projects. We've been doing this for a long time, right back from when Steve Ormerod and his collaborators got going on this. And it's a well-studied species in terms of what environment it needs, the diets, its breeding, and so on. So the obvious question arising from that statement is, why the Stroud Valleys Dipper Project? Why do we want to get this citizen science project going? And there were a number of reasons for doing this. First of all, it's a relatively unknown population, so it's not previously been very well studied. The population actually in the Forest of Dean has been studied and colouring, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. It's an important population due to its edge of range location. Now, what that means is the trailing edge of species distributions, particularly bird distributions, tend to be where the biggest changes first can be detected. So it's an important bioindicator population. We'll talk more about that later. There's also lots of potential change occurring in the River Frome catchment, a whole variety of different actions on the river and in the catchments surrounding the river. So there is a need for monitoring, and that monitoring must be set up so that it detects, measures, and, if at all possible, understands the impacts of those changes. And monitoring data, so monitoring is repeat survey year after year after year, is absolutely key to this. And this is the River Frome with its tributaries. So it's a very large river. It drains into the River Severn. It has 4 or 5 major tributaries, as well as the main river that runs through Stroud. And the outer reaches dry up quite a bit during the winter months, but most of it, because of the underlying geology, most of the river does stay flowing for most of the time. Even in summers like this, if you go into Stroud at the moment, you'll see the river is flowing very healthily. And that's a result of, we have very high water tables here, although I was talking to someone at the Environment Agency the other night and they were saying the water table has just started to go down, but generally the water is maintained through the Frome and its tributaries. So in 2025, I set up this pilot project, and we wanted to find out a number of things. Although I work at the university, and the university has paid for some of this, it's not actually a university project. I'm doing this on a voluntary basis. So I am one of the volunteers, one of the citizen science included in this. But what did we want to know? First of all, we wanted to know the level of public citizen interest in survey participation. We always suspected dippers would be a very popular survey focus, but we didn't know. We didn't also know what coverage across the catchment could we actually achieve. What were the best field recording methods for collecting information on dippers? And what were the best mapping and analysis methods also? So these are what we really wanted to have a look at during our pilot project. And I also came up with 5 working principles for this project. And the first is perhaps the most important, certainly as far as my wife is concerned. Do fewer things better. And I think in conservation, we can sometimes be very guilty. I remember when I worked at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, we were probably guilty of this. We try and do lots of things, and it sometimes impacts the quality of what we do and the amount of capacity we can throw at it. It's better to do fewer things better. And I've been trying to keep that, hold to that principle all the way through this citizen science project. The other thing is not to overburden the volunteers, our citizen scientists. We need to keep them informed and happy, and we've been doing that through regular updates. So we send a monthly, bi-monthly update on all of what's been going on the river catchment in relation to the dipper monitoring. And we ran a meeting for volunteers. We had 40 of our volunteers turn up at a meeting at Stroud Brewery, and we're doing the same this autumn as well. That went down very well. I think this is important as well. It's about ensuring that the collected data are of conservation use, i.e. not just fun and interesting to do. I hope it is still fun and interesting, but it has to be, we wanted the data collected to be of use. And I think informing the volunteers of what's happening is a way of making them feel that they are actually contributing to something that is important. And we very much wanted to link to existing initiatives in the riverfront catchment. There's an awful lot of activity. I'll show you some of it a bit later in the catchment. And we didn't want to just burst on the scene and go, ta-da, here's a fantastic shiny new dipper project. What we've done is set this up so that we can share the data, that we can allow others to benefit from our data as well. And this is the link with Colette and John. If you go on to the website, we have the Stroud Valleys Dipper Project website. That's the link there. We wanted to set up something, well, I should say I particularly wanted to set up something so that dippers sightings by our volunteers could be mapped in real time. In other words, I didn't really want to be sent thousands of bits of paper that I then have to upload into a website. So on the website, you'll see there is a mapping tool. And our surveyors, our citizen scientists, and members of the public, we've had a remarkable number of sightings from the members of the public, can go onto the website, access this tool, and they can put their records of what they have seen into a pro forma that automatically pops up for them. So they map where their dippers have been seen, the number, and there's a pro forma which asks about it, the observer confidence, the age, the behavior, whether it's a nest site, the number of dippers seen, and so on and so on. And that I can download straight into my database and then into a GIS, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. And the lovely thing about this in terms of the volunteers, they can see their records. Their records are permanently online. We've now got 2025 and 2026 on the same website, so they can see last year's records as well. And they can see what's happening in the adjacent areas, the adjacent survey sections, in terms of what other people are seeing of the dippers. So it was really nice, and I think this is a really functional but also good for the citizen science. So I created a catchment GIS, and so this is linked to the database, and I can start to visualize a range of different things. And it also is very convenient because it allows me to update my volunteers visually. I can tell them what's going on, where have the breeding birds been seen, which bits are being surveyed, which are not being surveyed, and so on. So that was a very important, the GIS was and remains a very important part of the project. And we'll come back to that when we start talking about habits in a little while. So during our pilot project, what exactly happened? What was the citizen science engagement with the project? What we asked them to do was 45 minutes in a section, and these sections are 500 meters long. So that I've broken the whole of the Froome up into 500-meter sections. They are numbered. They have a start and finish, so we can give them a what 3 words start and finish, so the citizen scientists know where to go and where to survey. Most people do more than just the 45 minutes. Most do more than one section. So there are some who have 5 or 6 sections, and we'll do this every 4 weeks. That's how we initially set it up. We've changed it slightly. We did just the breeding season last year, but you'll see we changed that slightly. Records are submitted via our website mapping tool, not sent in on paper. And we had 55 active surveyors. So there was a really good engagement with the project, and we advertised it through the BTO rep, through Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, through the Stroud Valleys Project, and we were really overwhelmed with the amount of interest that people showing and the amount of time that people were prepared to give us for the Dipper project. So we had 102 sections, 500-meter sections surveyed, which equates to about 51 kilometers of the 90 kilometers of the river Froome. So it was a fantastic effort. And we were delighted that there was such a huge response. And in 2025, we had 736 Dipper records submitted. So we had a really good, firm baseline from which to work. And this is an example of so this is the location of Dipper records. I don't know if you can see that too clearly. So green sections are those that were surveyed and Dippers recorded. Red sections were surveyed with no Dippers. Black was not surveyed in 2025. And the blue was actually not included. We weren't able to get, for various reasons, all of the catchment covered, largely because of land ownership issues and biosecurity as well. But I'll come back to that little wrinkle as well. So these are the sorts of things. So this is evidence of breeding activity, and this is the sort of things that I can send to our volunteers, just to let them know where their data are going, how are these data being used. And this is the sort of thing where I send them in their updates as well, the percentage presence or absence records by month, the different percentage of behaviors across the time, and so on and so on. So it's a really nice suite of very useful data where our citizen scientists can actually see how they are contributing to the project. So in terms of what we got from the pilot study back in 2025, we know that breeding density of dippers is highly variable across the UK. It's a function of river type, river speed, the pH of the water, and so on. But it ranges between about 0.2 to 1.8 pairs per kilometre of river. That is the national average density of dippers. So for us, we are currently working on a method to convert survey records and informations to a probability of breeding occurrence. We've got a variety of different options open to us, and we're working on that. And I've got a little sub-project trying to convert our database automatically into number of breeding pairs, but that'll be completed. That work will be completed next year. Probably at least 19 pairs in the surveyed area, which gives us a density of about 0.3 pairs per kilometre of river. And that's just for the areas. Don't forget there were quite a bit large chunks of the Froome that were not actually surveyed in 2025. If that density were constant across the catchment, we'd have 40 pairs, which represents about 0.6 of the UK population, which would be astonishing. It is likely to be lower in terms of density of birds, simply because the density is going to be lower, or they will be absent from the outer catchment, particularly those areas that dry up during the summer. This is yet to be worked on. This is one of the things we want to have a look at. So what did we do after the pilot study? So what have we been doing in the first 6 months of this year? So our actions for 2026 were monthly dipper surveys, so continuous all the way through. We weren't just doing the breeding season. We actually changed this over last summer, and many of our surveyors continued in 2025 also to do every month. So we now have a pretty good record of where they are during the winter as well. Very importantly, we have started to trial riverine and riparian surveys. So this is dipper habitats across the Frome catchment. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about that in a minute, so I'll just park that particular one. And of course, we wanted, as I mentioned, to analyse the dipper records from 25 and 2026. And we were very keen this year to link to the other conservation initiatives and different organisations working on the Frome. For 2027, we're going to continue with our monthly dipper surveys. We're going to try to extend the survey into unrecorded sections. I was keen to do that this year, but just time got away from us, and the principle of do fewer things better kicked in. But we are going to try. We've got some very good links with, obviously, with Gloucester Wildlife Trust and indeed FWAG, the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, and they have across the catchment very good links with the owners, the different owners of different parts of the rivers and the riparian habitats. So we're going to try and use that as a network to extend our survey into unrecorded sections. I'm very keen next year that we undertake at least one coordinated survey. In other words, we all go out at the crack of dawn, all the recorders, and record at the same time. A variety of reasons for doing that, and I'm hoping that we can talk about that during our next volunteer meeting in the autumn. And as I mentioned, we wanted to undertake riverine and riparian surveys. So these are the dipper habitats. Also very keen that we start discovering ways in which we can data share. And I had a very interesting meeting, very interesting chat, I should say, at an event run by the Gloucester Wildlife Trust last week, and talked to the Environment Agency and the Stroud Valleys Project, and indeed Colette and John, in terms of how can the data from the mapping that we've been doing, or the riparian habitat data we're going to collect next year, I'll explain that, how can those data be automated to be used by those that actually want these data. Also started colouring. We now have a colouring scheme. So we've got a little volunteer group. There's about 7 volunteers that come out with me, and we've been starting to catch dippers. We've also mopped up on most of the kingfishers in the catchment area. And we want to have a look at movement, obviously, within the catchment, particularly during the winter months, but also when the river in the outer parts of the catchment start to dry out. We've put up a few nest boxes. We're going to do more of that. I haven't really focused on that at the moment, and we're going to try and get some idea through colouring of chicks of survival and productivity, but that'll be next year. And indeed the turnover of pairs. So after they've bred for a couple of years, what happens? Are the territories taken over by the youngsters produced in that territory? Are there new different males that come in and establish a territory? We just don't know. And importantly, is there an exchange with the forested dean population? They have been colouring, Mervyn Greening has been colouring, and now Ed Druitt have been colouring in the forested dean for many years. And we want to see whether there is an exchange. That is the nearest population. And as I mentioned, movement out of breeding sites, the natal sites, or indeed the catchment. We put up a couple of boxes, more of that in 2027. We hope to establish quite a system of nest boxes where we can then monitor productivity. So what about these riparian habitats? What about the surveys that we can do? We had 4 options for this, and we were very keen not just to collect information using our citizen scientists on the dippers themselves, but also the riverine and riparian habitats associated with dippers. So our first option was to modify the Environment Agency's River Habitat Survey. Now, this is a very comprehensive survey. It gives structure, it indicates the structure and the flow of the river bed and also the bank habitats. So that was a possibility. The second was this thing called FFI, which was developed actually on a dipper population in Italy. It's called a fluvial functional index. And what you do is you go to the river and you collect different bits of information, and it's put into a metric, this FFI, which you can then grade different parts of the river in terms of their suitability, habitat suitability for dippers. The third option was the Modular River Survey, or MORPH, and we are still talking. We've got a meeting in late September about this and whether this can actually be done on the Froome. The issue with the first three options is those are big surveys. They would require our citizen scientists to be trained quite intensively. And we felt we were asking enough of them. We felt that they were giving us so much of their time, so much of their effort. And I'm sure a few of them would be keen to do this. But we also thought there's a huge number of big players. We are a tiny, tiny, tiny little voluntary player on the River Froome. There are some really big players, the Environment Agency, Gloucester Wildlife Trust, WWT, and so on. And I think it would be more appropriate for those guys to actually organize some sort of River Froome catchment survey. So what are we doing instead? So I've had an MSc student who's done a review of the published literature, and we're developing a metric of dipper features. So those features that are known to be good for dippers. And we've turned that into a sliding scale so that a particular section, so these 500-meter sections, can be evaluated in terms of those areas that are good for dippers. So we're going to do this every 100 meters, and those that are not so good for dippers. That is being trialled at the beginning of September. A message went round to our volunteers. We've got 11 volunteers who are coming to a day in beginning of September who are going to trial this method for us. We're going to look at the timing. We've created a pro forma for our volunteers, and we just want to know how much extra time and effort it would take our volunteers to do this. And what we will end up with for our sections is an idea of the relative quality of different parts of the river that we are currently monitoring. Of course, I mentioned linking with local partnerships and linking our citizen science dipper data with a variety of those. And obviously, very important and high up on that is WWT's Water Watch Collective, a fantastic initiative to try and pool initiatives and data together from the local area. There is the Wilder Froome initiative. So Environment Agency are big players, and Gloucester Wildlife Trust very heavily involved with that. There are several sites along the Froome that are used as river fly survey sites. And there is a variety of different Gloucester Wildlife Trust actions on the River Froome for a range of different species, so bats and beavers and fish and eels and so on. And we've been trying to link to these other players and just saying what it is we are collecting, what it is we're doing, so that they can benefit from our data. So what is the ultimate purpose of our dipper data collection? Well, we want to do some statistical analysis to understand factors affecting distribution, abundance, productivity on the River Froome. That's ultimately where this is going, but we are going to need quite a number of years of monitoring data, both monitoring the birds and also the environment, in order to be able to do that. We're hoping that this will establish monitoring that will allow us to detect, measure, and understand changes at a river level and their impacts on the dipper population. And the whole point of this really is to support evidence-based conservation initiatives in the catchment. That's what we want to do. So if there is a housing development and we can detect that it's having a change, what management can be put in place to try and effect a low impact on the local dipper population. And really what that is all about is using dippers as bioindicators of river change. That's really what this is all about. It's great fun counting birds, but this is the purpose, the larger, longer term purpose for this. But what exactly is a bioindicator? We should just quickly define what that is. So it's a species, or indeed a community of species, used to monitor the health of an environment by indicating how different elements of a system respond to environmental change caused by a particular stressor. So this is about a particular species responding in a particular way to environmental change caused by a stressor. That's really what this is all about. And dippers are actually good bioindicators. They're good bioindicators because they are moderately sensitive to environmental changes. In other words, they can detect problems before they become irreversible. Moderately sensitive to environmental change. And they react directly to the presence of specific perturbations. If there is a flush through of the river and the invertebrates community goes, they will have a direct response to that. And they'll also react to cumulative stresses. So, in other words, the general health of a particular river. And of course, really, we don't want the environment to change, but there are lots of pressures that lead to environmental change, all of these stresses. And the River Frome is a classic example of a river which has many, many different types of stresses. So this is going back to our original themes of the big four that we mentioned at the beginning. But how do we manage landscapes to prevent change? And most importantly, how do we know that we've been successful? Can we look at a way of evaluating how successful our system management has been? And this is where bioindicators are very useful. And this is a core conservation concept, really, that all landscapes are subject to a variety of disturbance events, these perturbations. And these perturbations vary in type, duration, spatial extent, and magnitude. And the River Frome is a classic example of that. Ecosystems within landscapes also have three qualities in relation to these sorts of perturbations. And we often refer to these as habitat stability, or ecosystem stability, resistance, and resilience. And I'll just mention those very briefly. So stability in a system is where you have the same species within a community over time. In other words, they don't change. You don't get species coming in, species going out. Resilience is a quality of a habitat or an ecosystem when it returns to a former state after disturbance. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have a huge flush through, as we did this year in January and February because of heavy rain, how quickly can it return, the invertebrates in the case, return to a former state? And resistance is about not changing during a disturbance. Are there physical and structural features within the landscape that allow it to not change despite there being big disturbances? So these are the things that we're really interested in bioindicating for. And environmental stresses are the agents of change to which an ecosystem must be resilient. So in terms of the River Frome, this might be through climate alteration, invasive species. There are a lot of invasive species up and down the river, pollution, urban and industrial developments, and effects of poor management. That can be land management or indeed management of the river, the height and speed of the river itself. And there are lots of those across the River Frome. And what do we need to know about these stresses? we need to know which ecosystem's components does it affect. So which species are likely to be impacted by different stresses. So if we have a bunch of trees that have dieback, that might affect dippers because they might like overhanging trees across the river, but that may be good for bats. It may be bad for dippers, good for bats. So which of the ecosystem components does it actually affect? And there are spatial and temporal considerations. So just because you have a pollution event in one area doesn't mean to say it's going to affect all areas. There will be a dilution effect, and we need to know the sorts of areas over which these stresses have an effect. And can we rank the likely impact of different stresses, localized to widespread, low to high impact, etc.? Ultimately, these are the sorts of evidence-based themes that the Dipper monitoring scheme will help to feed into. This is moving from description to understanding of what is actually going on our river system. And it is the citizen science data that allows us to do all of these different things. I just wanted to give a quick example because other birds have been used as bioindicators. And there are some difficulties with the component level used. What do I mean by that? Well, if you were to say that you would use CBC or BBS of wrens, would that be a good bioindicator of what's going on in the environment? And the answer is probably no. The wren would not be a good indicator of habitat stress, simply because it is so vulnerable to climate change, climate change. So in 1962-63, there was a very hard winter, and wren populations in the UK absolutely collapsed. This is an example from something that was very close to my heart when I worked for the British Antarctic Survey. This was looking at wandering albatross population declines. And you can see between the 70s and the 2010s, there was this ridiculously steep decline of the number of breeding pairs of wandering albatrosses. This is on South Georgia. But it didn't bioindicate an actual environmental problem. It was a function of fisheries fishing in a particular way, in this case long lines or squid jiggers. So we can only use individual components if they reflect ecosystem state. And that's the wonderful thing about dippers, is that we believe they will actually reflect ecosystem state. If the river is in poor condition because of different stresses, the dippers will indicate at those local sites the impact on the health of the river. So just to finish up, oops, yeah, nearly out of time. There are obviously some ongoing challenges for conservation. We've said we don't want the environment to change. We want the river Frome to get better. We don't want it to change for the worse. But do we understand what we mean by change? Is it the same for everyone? There are different stakeholder groups, different people interested in different elements of the river Frome. Do we understand exactly what we mean by what a change is? And at what point of a change do we want or need to act? Are there thresholds? Again, this is future work arising from the work being done on the river Frome. And do we have baselines for all parts of the United Kingdom? So probably not. And what do we measure change against? This is one of the reasons why we want to set up the colour ringing as well. We want a baseline of productivity and survival and distribution and movement so that we can monitor change against that baseline. And most importantly, all conservation organisations have this issue. Do we have the methods to detect and measure change? And of course, that is often comes down to funding and capacity. But these are really important things to do. We only know the world is falling to pieces and the environment around us are in difficulties because we detect and measure change. And we do that largely through monitoring, local species monitoring. This is why it's so important. So just to draw a few conclusions, dippers are good bioindicators. As I said, they're moderately sensitive to environmental change, they react directly, and they will react to cumulative stresses. So they're really useful for us. The information that we will be producing from the Stroud Valleys Dipper Project can be used for conservation and habitat management. So once we know what these birds require, where the best breeding occurs, where the most productive breeding occurs, and we can relate that to some habitats, we can start thinking about managing particular areas of the Frome catchment specifically for dippers. And we believe that it's a good idea to attempt to use volunteers for surveyors for habitat recording, not just the birds. This is an extension of the bird counts, but we think we've got a method now that is not too onerous on our volunteers, but will really enhance the work that all the volunteers, even if they don't get involved in the habitat recording, all the volunteers will benefit from. And the main conclusion from all of this really is thank goodness for our volunteers. Where would we be without them? And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.